Hi, and welcome to Radio Omnicore. I'm Colleen McClintock, your host, and I'm joined by Dr. Hilton Rudnick, my co-host, as always. In this episode, we are thrilled to explore the fascinating world of creative problem solving. Our guest today is Jenny Greenblatt, an expert in strategic innovation and creative problem solving. Jenny has dedicated her career to helping organizations address complex problems. She developed a systematic creative problem solving methodology, which is a mouthful, during her doctoral research. And she now shares this expertise with individuals and companies worldwide. In this episode, we will discuss how innovation can be structured to solve real challenges. We'll dive into the principles behind creative problem solving, the methodologies Jenny has developed, and, importantly, more practical examples of how these can be applied. So if you're curious about how to turn obstacles into opportunities, this conversation is for you. As always, thank you for listening. And now, here's our chat with Jenny Greenblatt. Welcome, Jenny. It's so lovely to host you on Radio Omnicore. We're excited to have a very creative and inspiring conversation about creative problem solving, and not to be confused with balloons and fidget spinners and bouncy balls, which we learned yesterday in our fascinating workshop with you. But welcome. What you've been busy with, what you're up to, give us the heads up of what's going on in Jenny's life.
Well, having recently submitted my PhD thesis on the subject, I am now doing some lecturing. So I'm lecturing at Wits Business School and GIBS. And I think it's what I would like to do is to share what I believe is a more empowering message about creative problem solving. I think that there are many assumptions about the topic which are not only wrong, but disempowering. And I would like to be able to spread the word that creative problem solving is something that everybody can engage with, and that you don't need to be, in inverted commas, a creative in order to do so. That's really my mission at the moment.
That's a very important one.
So Jenny, thanks for being here. I mean, maybe if we could start with like a simple example. If you had to take something that was creative problem solving versus just bog standard problem solving, what would the difference be in a simple example?
The key difference is the kind of problems that are appropriate for creative problem solving versus problem solving. So problem solving is just if there's one correct answer that you're looking for, then that would just be straightforward problem solving. But creative problem solving is about where there's no one correct answer. You've got a nice, complex, juicy problem with a lot of moving parts, and it's about generating a variety of solutions which are not only practical and will address the problem directly, but are also fresh and original. So a creative solution has to comply with both of those criteria: originality and utility. And I think very often it's the misunderstanding that both of those criteria need to be applied that has led to some of the myths around creativity, such as, children are a lot more creative than adults. And I say that's a myth. So I know I'm sticking my neck out in that regard, because it's such a well-established saying that as soon as you grow up and you will lose your creativity and your schooling just knocks it out of you. But it's important to challenge that assumption because, again, I think it's quite disempowering because it means that when you've grown up, then you just simply don't have it anymore. So I think that with children, very often they can come up with original solutions, but they're not always practical. So there are definite advantages of experience that we can use. And we don't just have to, as Colleen alluded to earlier, sit on bouncy ball and play with crayons in order to reinvigorate our creativity.
So, I mean, could you use it for something like when it comes to occupational choice? I've got to make a decision about what career I want to do. There's so many options. It's complicated.
Yeah.
So in everyday life.
It's something that we can draw on in both our personal lives and in our professional lives. And I think that the key enemy of creative problem solving is defaulting to just our normal, everyday, practiced ability to generate solutions, so that we don't dig deep in order to come up with the more creative ones. So in the example that you've just given, if we get a list of potential careers that we could get into, and we just pick one that we think is going to be easy to study, and that is going to make some money, and there it is on a list and it's ready packaged, then that's not going to be a particularly creative approach. A more creative approach to addressing that problem would be if we would dig deep into the problem and see maybe these are the more apparent solutions, but if we combine our own interests and talents and experience with what's out there and come up with a bit of a hybrid, then that's going to be a more creative solution to a problem that really is a really important life decision. And it's just really key that we don't default to the norm.
Jenny, what's your origin story, just like a superhero? Because when we originally spoke, I was like, this is amazing, because there isn't anything out in the market that I know of that you're busy training on. Working with our particular clients in the industry, in the corporate environment, this is often a development requirement or need in coaching. So what sparked this for you? And then also, what's your philosophy? What's built around your philosophy?
So after many years of consulting, I would often experience in my client organizations that they would espouse innovation as a really important value for them. But while they would say that that's a value, they wouldn't actually do anything to address that. So both in terms of training, in terms of providing any practical guidelines, it would just be a case of, like Rapunzel, just start spinning, spin straw into gold. We're not quite sure how, but just make sure that it happens. In addition, it is not typically something that is measured and rewarded. So while lip service is paid to the value of innovation, it's not really inculcated in a practical way into organizational processes and practices. So I saw that there was a real need to develop a structured methodology to support people to solve problems more creatively. One of my pet peeves is that the term brainstorming is often used to describe creative problem solving, and that's just one technique within the second stage of the creative problem solving process. So it's just one element. And when you say to people, let's brainstorm, it's a tautology. You're really saying the same thing. You're saying, let's brainstorm, let's be creative. And you're not actually giving somebody any guidelines as to, so how do I start? If you want me to think outside the box, what is the box? Where is outside relative to the box? And how do I get there? So that's how I came to developing a methodology for creative problem solving, is because I saw a real need amongst clients. There are a couple of principles that really underpin the methodology, and these are hard work, curiosity, and humility. And I think that those are probably the key principles, or at least the key philosophical principles that underpin the development of the methodology.
I mean, it definitely sounds like hard work. Is there a simple application of it? And I mean, I know I keep asking for simple stuff. I mean, I don't mean you to dumb it down, but just, is there a method that would give us some indication of the structure you're thinking of?
So one of the key problems with the typical approach to creative problem solving is that people jump into solutions. So that's why, as I say, there's people will say, let's brainstorm. The basic creative problem solving process is comprised of 3 simple steps, and that is problem construction, then ideation, and then selecting one of the creative solutions that you've proposed and taking that into a development stage and implementing that. So you'll find that basic structure in all different varieties of creative problem solving. It comes up in design thinking as well, which is really just a repackaging of the creative problem solving process. And if you're looking for techniques as to how to implement that process, the key issue there is that the devil's in the detail. It's about how to get into problem construction. What are the different tools that are available to ideate? And then what process do you go through in order to implement? Yes, it is hard work if you want to get away from default thinking, which, as I said earlier, is really the enemy of creative problem solving. We look for a solution that's going to work. So we come up with maybe 3 ideas and we think, okay, that one's going to work and let's go for it. But that is invariably not going to be a creative solution. It'll be a tried and tested solution. It'll be something that you can be quite confident or relatively confident it's going to work, but it's not necessarily going to be creative. So the creativity emerges from the hard work that you put into the problem construction, the ideating, and then the development.
I think when you were speaking earlier about organizational cultures not really rewarding or measuring creative problem solving, I'm sure many people were caught and interested in that. And maybe you can speak a little bit more to, well, what should leaders be doing to encourage this? How does one create a culture that brings it more visibly into what's expected of people?
I think if I go back to those philosophical principles of mine, the curiosity and humility and hard work is typically encouraged in an organizational context, so that's not too much of a problem, but I think humility is a big one. We tend to be uncomfortable in expressing humility in our understanding of problems, which is why very often I think we are uncomfortable sitting with a problem. We want a solution. We want to exhibit that we know what we're doing. There's that saying, don't bring me problems, bring me solutions. But an attitude of humility, and instills that in an organizational culture where we don't know everything and we haven't explored everything. I think that lays the groundwork for people to be able to exercise curiosity, to explore, and to say, you know what, I don't actually know the right answer right now, or I don't know the best answer right now. I've got an answer that I think could work in this context, but it's not necessarily going to be the best answer. Let me ask some questions. Give me some time. So if organizations were able to nurture the ability to not only have humility, but to be able to express our humility as well, I think that would go a long way to supporting more creative problem solving.
And Jenny, that really does speak to the psychological safety aspect of being able to say, I don't know. So that makes a lot of sense.
Absolutely. And, when we say that we don't know, it's actually such a liberating experience. It brings to mind an experience that I had. For some reason, a lot of people think that I'm a psychologist. I'm not. I've got an honors in psychology, but I'm not a psychologist. And so somebody once said to me, you're a psychologist, aren't you? And I said, no, I'm not. And so she said, well, what are you? And I said, I'm a nothing. I mean, I was half joking, but what I also meant was I'm not an engineer, I'm not a medical doctor, I'm not a psychologist, I don't have that label. But what was so interesting to me is when I expressed that, I'm a nothing, it gave me such a feeling of liberation. It gave me a charge, because if you're a nothing, you're in everything. If you don't have those limitations, if you don't have those constraints around how you label yourself, if you've got that humility, then you're open. You don't have anything to prove. And so, again, I think that it's humility and curiosity go hand in hand. And I don't think that you can have creativity without them. Maybe if you're a Steve Jobs and you're an out there creative person, and you can say with confidence, listen, make me a phone that's got no buttons, and then everybody has to scramble in order to do it. Maybe there are those rare individuals. But for the rest of us mortals, I think that having that humility that underpins our curiosity is really fundamental in creativity.
So, Jenny, I mean, we have, like a team of managers making 10 decisions an hour. And, sometimes it's a client that's, gone off the rails, or something's melted down, or, we've got a unique situation that we've got to fix. Is the creative problem solving method, like a mode that you get into when there's just like big things to think about? Or would you simplify it into just my everyday, I've got all these decisions and I've got a problem that's come up, I've got to solve it in 5 minutes. Is that not the time to be getting into creative problem solving and you're just in a normal mode, or is it something that you reserve just for the big things?
I would say that it is something that you reserve for the big things, and that you actively set aside the time to solve problems that warrant it. So the model that I've developed, I've called concentrated curiosity, because it involves, there's a bit of a paradox in there, but it involves concentrated focus in order to unpack and understand the problem that you're working with, and then the ability to exercise your curiosity in order to break free of the various constraints that will inevitably be part of the creative problem-solving process. There's never going to be a situation where you've got no constraints around how you solve that problem. So I do think that it's important to set aside some specific time, some concentrated time, and whether that's in one session or over time, I think that it's knowing that you are engaging and actively engaging in the creative problem-solving process is what's going to get you out of that default mode. You can't be creative problem solving all the time. It's going to be exhausting. So, you don't want to get into a creative problem solving exercise to find out, where your keys are located. But they're going to be some typical problems, some everyday problems that you're going to just need to solve by default. You're not going to necessarily come up with a new route to fetch your kids from school every day, but there are some problems that warrant that concentrated focus time.
Jenny, we are going through the process with you now as our leadership team, which has been fascinating. And I shared with you yesterday after the session around questioning and different prompts for different types of questions that I have a new respect for how many questions there can be. And then just also how flippant we are when we make big decisions, when there's so many alternative ways we could have potentially made the decision. One of the ways that you work is using this action learning approach. And I wonder if you can speak a bit more about that and what prompted you to use that, and how does it show up in the way that you run your workshops?
I think it's really important to put the principles into practice and to apply them to a problem that is meaningful to you. So while I can share the principles of creative problem solving and how to go through the steps and the details in the methodology, it only makes sense when you apply it. Again, there's a paradox, I think, or some dynamic tension in the methodology, because on the one hand, I have got a very rigorous and structured methodology, which has got a huge bunch of prompts, specifically to take people out of their comfort zone, to explore aspects of the problem that they might overlook. So I specifically actually want to take people out of their comfort zone because, again, it's about moving away from the default mode of thinking. But on the other hand, people also need to be able to apply their own discretion and choice when they look at which prompts are going to be more useful to them, which constraints are going to be more relevant to apply. Back to this bouncy ball and total freedom approach to creativity, there is, again, a myth that constraints are antithetical to creative problem solving. But research has also consistently shown that properly applied constraints, and in fact constraints that people choose, are going to result in the generation of more creative solutions. So constraints are actually really useful. And when we just allow people to think about a problem in a completely free space and say, do what you want, play with these crayons, come up with some ideas, then typically they're not going to move out of their comfort zone. So on the one hand, it's about applying some constraints, having a structured methodology that moves you into corners that you may not explore, and that also then applies constraints in such a way that you've got to kind of elbow your way out of them, and you've got to work hard to think through the problems in those ways. but also to use them in a way that makes sense to you. So there is that dichotomy within the methodology, within the principles.
Jenny, maybe you can unpack for us, you've got these three big baskets, the constructing the problem, and then the ideation, and then the kind of selection of the solution. Maybe go into the constructing of the problem a little bit more depth, because it sounds like what's very important to you is to arrive at a really, well nuanced shape of what is the problem we're focusing on.
Problem construction has actually been quite consistently shown to be the most important element in the process. Not to say that the other elements aren't important. Obviously, you've got to generate ideas, and obviously they're not going to turn into innovations. They'll just remain ideas if you don't go through the third step. But if you don't have that setup step, then typically the solutions that you generate are not going to be as creative, and they also may not be as applicable to the problem. A lot of people will think that that implies looking for the root cause of the problem, but very often addressing the root cause can be too onerous or too expensive, and so it's not really about understanding the root cause. Sometimes that's the case, but sometimes it's not. But it's about understanding what are all the moving parts within this problem, and as I've expressed it, to develop a complex, fluid mental model of the problem. So you understand all the bits and pieces. You know what the parts of the problem are. You know how they are related to each other. You can dip into the problem from different perspectives. And then you have got fertile ground in which that you can use to start generating ideas. So that problem construction, that first stage, is really fundamental. There are 3 sub-stages to the problem construction stage, and they involve, first of all, problem identification, and then the information search, then problem framing. Problem identification is typically not well practiced, again, because, as I've mentioned, we're uncomfortable with problems. We don't want to actively look for problems. We want to run away from them. But if we actively scan and proactively scan for problems, there really are opportunities that could go undetected, because if something's not staring you in the face as a problem, and it could be a situation that's working reasonably well but not optimally, you may not recognize it as a problem. But if you go on an active hunt for problems, then you can discover a situation like that as a potential opportunity to optimize some situation in the organization. So that's the problem identification. Then there's the information search. And as you mentioned, Colleen, I have developed quite an exhaustive and structured battery of questions around the problem, again, to prompt people to look at aspects which they may not have considered. And I've tested this out with a variety of people who come from a variety of different industries. Seems to be quite generically applicable. And the kind of feedback that I have received is, geez, we would never have thought of this. If you hadn't posed this question, this is something that we actually hadn't considered. So that for me is a real win. If we're uncovering an aspect of the problem that hadn't been previously considered, that opens up some opportunities. So that's your information search. And then it's about the problem framing. And your problem frame is really the lens that you use to apply or to focus your attention on a specific aspect of the problem. So once you've got a good understanding of what's involved, then you can say, this is the aspect that I want to home in on, or I want to, the whole lot together as a system, looking at a broad problem frame. That's the approach that I'm going to be taking. So those are the stages within the problem construction phase. Then there's idea generation, where there are a variety of fantastic ideation tools available. Brainstorming is one ideation tool, and it has in fact been shown to not be an overly effective method of idea generation. even when the rules of brainstorming are applied. Typically, organizations actually won't apply the rules of brainstorming. They'll just say, let's brainstorm, which is just another way of saying, come, let's think hard. What can we come up with? Um, but but there are certain rules of brainstorming, such as you need to, judgment only happens afterwards. That's a key one, and everybody must, air their views. But it's very open-ended, and it doesn't use any prompts. With ideation tools, there are specific ways of channeling your thinking and prompting your thinking, again, to get you out of that default mode, sometimes in a way that can seem quite wacky. So there's one technique that's called the worst idea technique, where you are actually asked to think about what is the worst idea that you could possibly come up with. That's often used in a context where people are stuck and where they feel that they've got to come up with a really good answer. So you challenge that and you say, okay, now let's actually come up with the worst idea you can possibly come up with. And then you think, are there any seeds in this whole battery of bad ideas that people have generated? Are there any seeds of good ideas within that list? And you use that to propagate some more useful solutions. So that's, in a way, it's kind of an icebreaker, but it also just bumps people out of their normal channel of thinking. So that's ideation. And then implementation involves looking for solutions or potential solutions that have been put on the table, which may not seem to have immediate value, but need to be nurtured and shaped and developed into something that could be implemented. And then it's about selecting those ideas, seeing what you can do with them, seeing how to sell those ideas, and developing an implementation plan in order to launch them. I think it's important to mention here that very often it is difficult to sell a creative idea simply because it is original. So by definition, it's risky, it's untried and untested. And so you will need to convince people that you've dotted your I's and crossed your T's and you've looked through the potential ramifications of implementing that solution and sell why it's something that could be viable.
What is the difference between critical thinking and creative problem solving? When you speak about in your workshop looking at things through the lens of your stakeholder, it reminds me a little bit of the 6 thinking hats with Edward de Bono. What is the difference between the approaches?
In fact, the 6 thinking hats is actually a very useful approach to apply in that implementation stage, that third stage where you've generated ideas and then you're looking to see which could potentially be viable. So I think, I'm glad you mentioned that. I wouldn't say that there's a difference between critical and creative thinking, but the two elements that are important in creative thinking include convergent and divergent thinking. And convergent thinking is often seen as critical thinking. So and divergent thinking is where you open up to a wide variety of possibilities. Originally, in the creative problem-solving literature, divergent thinking was almost seen as creative thinking. But now, with the research that's been done, I think it's pretty widely accepted that you need to use both divergent and convergent thinking. So you need to open up to a wide variety of possibilities, but you also need to exercise discretion. So that's your convergent thinking or your more critical thinking. You need to exercise discretion to say, are we going in the right direction here? Maybe it is fresh and original, but is it going to be addressing the key elements of the problem? So you need both aspects. They both need to work hand in hand, and very often it's an iterative process about moving between the one type of thinking and the other. Again, there are tools to help to generate more divergent and more convergent thinking, and they both need to come into play.
In terms of ideation, I can hear you're iffy about brainstorming, and you had the worst idea kind of model. What would you advocate in addition or as a supplement to brainstorming?
So a technique that I have found works very nicely with my clients is the Scamper technique. And that's really an acronym for different mental operations that you can apply. So you look at what can be substituted, what can be combined, what can we add, what can be magnified, what can be put to another use, what can be eliminated, and what can be replaced. So there are certain mental operations that you engage in that I found works quite intuitively and may seem hard to implement, but people actually gravitate quite naturally towards those operations. Another one which I find very useful is brain walking or brain writing. And the reason for its value is that it incorporates both individual ideation and team ideation. So I think, again, there's a myth that can be dispelled, is that we need a team in order to think creatively. But actually, again, research shows that typically people will come up with more creative solutions when working on their own. I think that one needs to then temper that, however, with the need for gleaning diverse opinions as well. So there is also value in working in a team. So I think that one needs to harness the potential of both your individual ideation and working in a team. And the techniques of brain walking or brain writing draw on both. So a technique like brain writing is where individuals would come up with a solution or an idea, and they would then pass that to the next person in the team, who would then build on that, and then somebody else would build on that. So there you are getting diverse opinions, but you are also not feeling judged, especially because you're writing it on a piece of paper and passing it to the next person. Colleen, you mentioned psychological safety. We are inevitably going to say stupid things when we're trying to come up with original ideas. A lot of them are going to be stupid. And we've got to feel comfortable coming up with those stupid ideas. And very often it's going to feel a lot safer if we do it just on a piece of paper that you can pass to the next person and then just wait for their muffled laugh, as opposed to for the whole team to just pack out laughing at you and you're like, are you crazy? Then ultimately you get your piece of paper generated at the end of that process, which has got your original idea and a whole bunch of additions to that idea. And you've then got a meatier solution to be able to deliver. So a technique like that is something that I think works pretty well too.
It sounds like pass the parcel. So, Jenny, you do lecturing. You mentioned at Wits Business School and GIBS, and I'm sure your typical client is, I don't know, not that open to anything with the word creative in. They want to go more for the logical. Maybe if you said critical thinking, they would be more comfortable with it. How do you balance logical thinking and creative problem solving?
So I think that it's often by demonstrating. I think that often one has to sell the approach by demonstrating the potential value of the solutions that one would generate using that approach versus just jumping to a solution. And one example that I can think of is when I've worked with a client who had a problem with maintenance. Their clients would come back to them with maintenance issues and they weren't always being resolved on time. There wasn't enough follow-up. And what they felt was the logical solution was that they needed to invest in a call center and invest in some new technology for logging the calls that came in. And that for them was, and I think it's a case for many people, it's just use technology to plug the hole. And there's got to be a technological solution and it'll make the problem go away. But when we went through a creative problem-solving process, after unpacking the problem and seeing how do clients experience it, where is the pain really felt, let's analyze some of the data from the call center to see how long are certain problems taking to be resolved? Who are the clients who are complaining most often? What are the kinds of situations that would then result in a complaint afterwards? What we identified is that really the problem was in the communication. So it wasn't just the logging of the call, but it was the communication in coming back to the client and saying, we thought that this part would be ready by next week, Tuesday, but it's actually not. There's been a problem with our suppliers. We're only going to get it on Friday, and we'll come to you on Friday. As long as expectations were managed, clients were comfortable with that because they were reasonable. They didn't expect an immediate turnaround, but they just wanted to know that they'd been heard and they'd been acknowledged and their problem was in hand and being managed. Well, the solution to that could be pretty simple. Again, by looking at the problem construction and seeing the problem differently, it then lay the groundwork for establishing a solution that would actually address the immediate needs of the client, as opposed to A, requiring a far bigger investment, and B, being a lot longer, and C, actually just skirting around the real issues.
So Jenny, is your consulting, if you go into a business and they say, we got this massive problem, we just don't know what to do, is your consulting to walk them through the different stages and come out with, their solution at the end? Is that like a single session? Is it over months? What are the pragmatics of that?
As I say, I am asking people to think differently, to think more deeply, to think about issues that they may not have considered, and that does require facilitation. It could be quite easy to say, look, these are the stages of the problem-solving process, stage 1, stage 2, stage 3, these are the sub-steps, and here you go, take it away and, run with it. But again, because it is the new way of thinking, it's about thinking harder about a problem than you might have before. It's about creating that space for humility, as I mentioned, and interrogation, and being able to express, gee, we hadn't considered this aspect before. That, just from my experience, does require detailed facilitation. So it does take a while, because if you want to unpack the elements, and especially if you want time in between for people to go and research and get opinions from other people as well and say, we thought about this in our logistics department, but actually we need to speak to the marketing department who've got more direct interactions with customers. We need their input on this as well. I think there needs to be some breathing time in between the sessions that I run. So those sessions themselves can be quite intensive, so we can't run them for, 3 hours at a time. People get exhausted. It's about a phased approach, and people go away and think about it and come back to the next session and say, I got this insight from a colleague of mine. We need to interrogate the data that we've got, and that can flesh out our understanding. So it is the phased facilitated process.
And is there any place inside of that for, I don't know, I guess it would be the enemy, but for something like intuition? If you say, I've just got a bad feeling about this, it's just not us. Can that come into it, or is it, it's got to be logical?
No, absolutely. There has to be, it's got to tie in with your values as well. And I think, intuition, I don't think is something that's just magical. I think that it is based on a couple of sound criteria as well. If you feel uncomfortable about something, there are typically going to be some solid reasons as to why you feel uncomfortable. It's just that maybe at the time you aren't able to voice them. Maybe they don't tally with your values. It could seem too out there or risky, and that's fine and that's good. Very often we think, there's that idea of the incubation process, and we say that in order to come up with a creative solution, you just need to sit with it and let your subconscious work on it. But the subconscious also needs some material. The subconscious needs some nuts and bolts. So I think the subconscious also draws on your conscious thinking. And if you've done a lot of hard work around it, and then you go off and have your shower, then you'll come up with ideas. If you just get into the shower without having done the hard work, the quality of the ideas that you're going to generate aren't going to be quite as great.
I apologize in advance for this question because it's becoming so cliched, but what now is the role of AI in this process? Could I not just throw my question into ChatGPT and just keep refreshing and asking it for more solutions?
The danger of AI, again, from a philosophical perspective, is that really we don't want anybody else doing the thinking for us. Thinking is such a joy, and it's such a pity to get out of practice and to say, I don't want to go through the mental effort and I want somebody else to come up with a solution for me. Typically, it's not going to have a fit with values that haven't been expressed. Hilton, as you mentioned, like sometimes you've got an intuition that something's not going to work for you. If you haven't told whatever AI tool you're using, if you haven't told them, look, the solution also needs to comply with these and these and these and these values and criteria, and maybe those are things that are important to you that you haven't necessarily voiced. You know them when you're coming up with a solution, but AI is only going to generate solutions relative to using the inputs that you've given it. So I think that there are some limitations there. But there's definitely value as well. So I think there's value in collaborating with AI. One example that I've seen that I think is potentially really useful is that when we want to explore different perspectives on a problem, we can actually ask AI to tell us the story of that problem from the perspective of a different person. Very often AI will actually have, we know who Emily Bronte is, because there'll be some facts about Emily Bronte or Charles Darwin, and we'll say, okay, tell me the story of this problem from the perspective of Emily Bronte or from the perspective of Charles Darwin. And then you're actually getting some different perspectives. And again, useful if you've said through the eyes of somebody else, because you've got an idea of what those biases might involve, and then they cast light on the problem from different perspectives. So I definitely think that AI can help to explore a problem from different perspectives, but not necessarily to generate the solution that is going to be most relevant to you. I don't think we should be letting ourselves off the hook too easily there.
I have another also random question, which is, how is it like living in your house if you, the parent, and there's a problem to be solved? How does it influence your parenting?
As I've mentioned before, I like people to think hard. So I might be a little bit tiring in that regard. I think I might be a little bit tedious, but I do like people to apply, when I say people, I'm talking about my children, obviously, to apply effort to working through, to thinking through a problem and considering different perspectives. And of course, sometimes you just need a quick solution, but I do like my kids to apply effort. As I've always espoused the Carol Dweck's growth mindset, which is that the effort is far more important than the end results. So I think if one teaches that way of thinking, then even if it's not specifically in the creative problem-solving context, ultimately effortful thinking is going to serve the purpose, higher quality and more original thinking as well.
Jenny, what was your PhD question?
It was about how to optimize the problem construction process using alternative approaches to problem framing and to the information search. And there's very little work that's been done around the information search, and so that was nice to be able to explore that. It's a relatively fresh area, and one of the key findings that has emerged is that the active processing of information is really important, but a different approach to generating questions that would keep people digging deeper, looking in fact for questions as opposed to just for answers, and actively instilling curiosity. One can say that you need to use curiosity, you need to be humble, you need to apply cognitive persistence. So one can say those things. But what was important to me then was, how do you develop an approach that actually makes those things happen? My approach is very much a behavioral approach. I don't think that you can just say, come on everybody, let's be motivated, let's be engaged. I don't think that you can just say to a person, be curious. Based on the model that I've developed and the research that I've conducted, actively generating questions makes a person more curious because you become more engaged in the material. So it's about, how do you put certain processes in place? How do you advise people on the steps, practical steps that they need to take in order to generate those states of mind? So a lot of my thesis was based on that.
It must be quite tricky scientifically to nail down the kind of efficacy of a problem solving or a problem framing kind of method, because I don't know if you don't really have a control group, so I guess mostly what you're doing is asking the people involved whether they found it a productive process or a useful right? Or is there something more, where you can check two outcomes and say this one was quantitatively better than that one?
There is an approach that I've used where it wasn't a control group, but I had a baseline condition and then an experimental condition, where first of all people generated creative ideas to a particular problem without using, and then they did the same thing by using the methodology. And the solutions that they generated were then judged, not by me, but by a panel of experts, people who knew about the problem. They rated them using those criteria of, does it solve the problem in a practical way, and is it fresh and original? And so then there was a quantitative score that was generated about, was that a good creative solution? So you could actually score the creativity of solutions and compare the before and after. So that is an approach that I used in my research. But in practice, for me, the litmus test is getting that feedback afterwards. Gee, this is something we'd never have thought of. We're coming up with ideas that we hadn't come up with before. That, for me, is the litmus test of, has it been a successful exercise?
So is this a burgeoning field? I mean, is there, are there guru authors in this field who you defer to, who inform you? And who would you recommend in that area?
As I mentioned earlier, the area of design thinking, which has been popularized by the group IDEO, has brought creative problem solving, or the ideas related to creative problem solving, to the fore. The packaging, I think, is really sexy, and I think that helps, because the originators of creative problem solving were really really back in the 40s, with Alex Osborne was the originator of that methodology, which has then gone through a number of iterations. But unless you're looking through the academic literature, you're probably not going to come across these real gurus and the people that I would rate. But I think there is value in using a package like design thinking, because it has gained popularity. It's made creative problem solving cool and sexy, and you think like Polanets and the whole thing. So I think that there is value in that. But again, within that methodology, I don't see practical steps. And there's some terms that are used, like empathy. And that's a nice term, because who doesn't want to be empathetic? And what empathy really means is it's an aspect of your information search, but it's going to be applicable to some problems and not to all problems. I mean, if you're looking at, like at a maintenance problem, for example, yes, there may be some ways in which you want to look at empathy, like, is the client being heard? But there's some aspects of looking for the data on which of the problems are being reported on most often. There are other aspects to the information search that actually don't involve empathy at all. So I think that using terminology can attract people to the field, but then you need to empower people with structured steps in order to facilitate that, because just exercising empathy, for example, is not actually going to do anything. You can have all the empathy in the world, and that's not necessarily going to help you to generate a good solution.
Thank you, Jenny. I think that's a really good place to highlight the end of our session around empathy. I am feeling very disappointed, however, that Tigger didn't join today. Your beautiful, magnificent dog. Maybe next time. But yeah, it's been fascinating, and a lot of food for thought for people to change their biases and their assumptions around what creative problem solving is and how you can apply it and change the way you go to stop the default thinking. So thank you very much. Any closing comments from you, Hilton?
No, thanks. I mean, I would imagine every organization in the world is looking to finesse and enhance their thinking. I mean, small little blunders can sink empires. And, just making the right tactical choice can, be a boon to a company. So the stakes are always really high. So yeah, no, thanks, Jenny. Very insightful. We're looking forward to seeing where this goes.
And that's a wrap for today's episode of Radio Omnicore. A huge thanks to Jenny Greenblatt for sharing her expertise on creative problem solving and providing us with invaluable insights. To our listeners, your support means everything. Do dive into the show notes for more insights and resources, and please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe if you're keen. It really does help our podcast grow. Thank you again for tuning in. Until next time, keep innovating and stay curious.